She's right now. We got her overseas in 1973, and we were gone for about 30 years. And she still gets teary-eyed thinking about SIU. So I think she had to come here for that. So I can't talk about this. The UN is so broad and so important and so critical in today's world that I can't deal with it comprehensively. So I'm gonna just focus on a couple of issues in a couple of countries that I have personally experienced. The UN has a particular role in the world. It's unique. There's no agency or a company or a country that can do what the UN does, as you've just heard. Refugees, peace and stability, all sorts of issues having to do with treaties, water rights, the environment, protection of our environment. I mean, you can just go on and on. There's dozens of different areas where the UN plays a critical role that no other entity can play. And I'm really sorry and afraid that this is not understood by many people. In the United States, people think that it's a useless organization. Many people think that. And I can tell you that is the furthest thing from the truth. It's critical and very, very important. And it's also very important that the United States continue to support the work of the UN. And that's why we're very concerned about, word we're hearing about a retreat from the U.S.'s commitment to the UN. As you know, they pay 22% of the UN's basic budget, which, and they also provide funding to many of the different agencies on top of that. So this funding is critical. And I just want to go over some of these things about the UN and what it does. First of all, let me say that the work of the UN really goes back to trying to set up a new world order after the cataclysm of World War II. And the Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed in Paris on December 10th, 1948, was critical because it set the underlying basis of human rights. And that's really what the UN is based on. And many of the programs, directly or indirectly, relate to the rights of individuals, irrespective of the quality or democracy or the environment in which they're living. So it's very, very important that the work of UN is supported. I'm going to talk about UN agencies. The UN works in different ways. It works internationally in terms of signing agreements and understandings and so forth and so on, but it also funds not-for-profits, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. I always thought that was a strange term to designate all of those not-for-profit agencies that work on various relief and development efforts in the world, to define them as being non-government. That's, everything, it's non-government, but that's what it's been called for a long, long time, and I think we have to just live with that. The UN has three ways to deliver its services to us. It can operate programs directly through one of their agencies. It can fund the host government, or it can work in funding and collaboration with not-for-profits, with agencies like Catholic Relief Services and World Vision. And in some cases, for example, in the Sudan, it does more than that. It provides the framework for our very presence in the country. And I'll get back to that later. I want to talk about two countries where and I'll talk about World Vision because of the timing. I want to talk about how the UN was able to help us to achieve our goals. Actually, there's the same goals as the UN did. Protect children. World Vision is a child-focused agency. We're trying to protect very, very vulnerable children all over the world. And World Vision is a huge organization, over $2 billion in programs in 100 countries. And I was lucky enough to be the World Vision director in Kenya for 4 years, from 1998 until 2002. And I want to share with you a couple of things that happened to me that were directly impacted by the assistance of the UN. The first one is a drought. Unlike droughts in the developed world, a drought in Africa and other very poor countries is life-threatening because people in the rural areas depend on their food crop to live. If there's no rain, there's no food crop, and there's no way to live. So those people are very susceptible to famine. And this has happened more than once, and it keeps happening. It's a tragedy, but that's where the World Food Program and other agencies have come in to help tremendously. And in the case of Turkana, which is the northern area of Turkana, that was facing a drought, and they had a very serious drought. So we went up there, World Vision, and we arranged to have a program with the support of the World Food Program, and everything was coming along very well. I was really pleased, and I said, well, I have to go up there and see what's going on. So I went up to Turkana, in a very isolated, very poor area, and a few colleagues were with me, and we waited for the local chief to come. We were sitting under a tree in the middle of nowhere, waited for about an hour, so he finally came up, and we sat down and we talked about the drought and how it was affecting people, and how bad it was. And then he said, well, why don't we go look at the people? Well, sure, the women, of course, I'd love to. So we get up and we start walking over a little tiny hill, and there they were. There were thousands of women with their children, and they were in very, very bad financial, nutritional situation. I could see very clearly that a number of those babies who were being held were not going to make it more than a few weeks more. They were really at the end. And that was just typical. And so I was so happy that I already had a World Food Program, and I can say with confidence that within 2 or 3 weeks we would have life-saving food for literally thousands and thousands of people in this vast region called Turkana. Okay, and then there's a second incident I also want to share with you about a situation we had in Kenya. Kenya, I'm sure you perhaps have been reading about it, is the home to many refugees fleeing from outside of Kenya. Most notably, a number of years ago, the Kenyan government decided it didn't want to have refugees walking around on their own around the country. So they said any refugee who enters our country has to go to one of 2 refugee camps. One is Kakuma in the north, and the other one is Dadaab, which is near Somalia. Kakuma, which is the one we were working with, had about 180,000 people, and it still has. I just saw the other day they still have 180,000 people there. The other one, Dadaab, is very close to the Somali border, and it's basically all the Somalis who have fled the fighting in Somalia, and they've come to Dadaab. Now, Dadaab has been growing and growing. When I was there 15 years ago, it had a population around 300,000. I saw a note the other day that it had increased, and now Dadaab has 500,000 population. That makes it the largest refugee camp in the world. It's like a city, and it has to be run. It has to be run by guess who? United Nations Human Rights Organization, HCR. And so this is, and they run both camps there. Okay. So we were asked by the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, if we could help them out with an issue. What they wanted to do was resettle, or to work with the United States government to resettle Bantu Somalis who were in Dadaab. They wanted to have them go to the United States, go through the process. And they wanted us to build 2,200 mud and brick huts for them in Kakuma, because they were being transferred from Dadaab to Kakuma before they were interviewed, through the screening process. Now, the reason why they had to be transferred is that Dadaab was 100% Islamic. And many of the people who had to interview them, the Americans from what was called in those days INS, now it's called Citizenship Immigration Services, the government felt it was too insecure to send these people out to Dadaab. So they wanted to bring them to Kakuma and interview them there. So we built 2,200 of these structures, And between 2003 and 2007, the U.S. government accepted over 13,000 Bantu Somalis. Now, who are the Bantu Somalis? The Bantu Somalis were the descendants of slaves that various groups had captured in various parts of Africa and brought to Somalia as slaves. And for generations and generations, they were slaves in Somalia to the Islamic owners. And they spoke the same language, Somali, but culturally they were very different, and they were discriminated against very badly. So the United States government in that day made the resettlement of Bantu Somalis a priority. So I'm proud to say that the U.S. government accepted over 13,000, and I think a few more still coming in. One of the problems of living in a refugee camp is you go through this whole process of interviewing and screening, and then you have to wait for a government, some government, to say, okay, you can come to our country. The United States is just one country of many, many countries, and the same thing is happening now for those thousands and thousands of people who have fled Syria. You know, and guess who manages that? UNHCR. So, you know, it's just playing a wonderfully important role, a critical role. No other entity can manage this except for the UN. It's just important to remember that. So I'm very grateful for support of the UN, particularly UNHCR and WFP in Kenya. So that's the story in Kenya. I'm very, very grateful. I have here a picture of the Prime Minister of Japan, Mori, the only sitting Prime Minister of Japan to ever visit Africa, and he visited only two countries, South Africa and Kenya. And while he was in Kenya, he visited Kakuma refugee camp. And this is Sagata Ogata. She was the Japanese High Commissioner for Refugees, head of the UNHCR, for 10 years, from 1991 to 2000. And this picture was taken in January of 2001. So she had just finished her 10-year term. And he was very happy to see the great work that the UNHCR, of course, what's really happening is the Japanese government was financially supporting this work, you see, so he had to show, you know, his support for this work. So I'm very happy I got a picture of him. Okay, now I want to talk about another country that I have a long involvement with. It's Sudan. Sudan is one messed up country, I can tell you. I first ran into Sudan in 1980 when I was appointed director of the program there for Catholic Relief Services, but based in Khartoum. Okay, we had what we call the maternal child health with USAID, U.S. government funding food program. So it was trying to help children during a critical period of their youth to have better nutrition as they're developing preschool. And I had a small program in the south, and that was during the period what they call the peace. Now I have to go back and explain a little about Sudan. Sudan is the largest, well, before the separation, before South Sudan, it was the largest country in Africa, okay? And about 1 million square miles. Now, South Sudan is about 1/3 of that. So it's still it's a huge country. And historically, the British completely messed up their colonial administration of Sudan. They started to administer the north and the south differently. They wouldn't let the northerners go to the south and the southerners go to the north. And to make a long story short, it was a mess. And as a result, at independence, the northerners got control of the whole country. And the south didn't like that at all. They weren't represented, they were marginalized, discriminated against in many, many different ways. And they were ethnically African, not Arabs. And they weren't, the Sudanese considered themselves members of the Arabic community. There's nothing wrong with that, but it was constant tension. And so the first civil war broke out shortly after independence in 1956 and lasted 16 years, and was finally settled in the Addis Ababa Agreement in 19